In an unprecedented move that has sent shockwaves through the royal world and British politics, the UK Parliament has voted to exile Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from Britain permanently. Once beloved members of the royal family now face a complete ban from the country that shaped their public lives. So, what led to this historic decision? How will it reshape the monarchy? And what does this mean for Harry and Meghan? Join us as we uncover the shocking move by the UK Parliament against Harry and Meghan. Shocking parliamentary exile vote on Harry and Meghan. The chamber fell into a silence so profound that it felt almost unnatural, the kind of quiet that comes once in a generation. Members of Parliament, normally loud, boisterous, and constantly clashing during votes, froze completely as the Speaker of the House stepped forward to the dispatch box. His voice, usually firm and unshakable, wavered ever so slightly as he read the results aloud. 347 votes in favor, 216 against. The motion to officially exile Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from the United Kingdom had passed, and the size of the majority left even the most ardent supporters of the measure stunned. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the chamber erupted, not with cheers, not with boos, but with a far stranger sound, a low, spreading murmur creeping across the benches like wildfire. It was a collective gasp of disbelief mixed with grim satisfaction, a noise that hinted at awe rather than celebration. Outside, the cold December air at Westminster carried the frantic shouts of journalists who had been stationed there since dawn, phones in hand, racing to transmit the news. Within 90 seconds, every major news network around the globe had interrupted programming to report what had just happened. For years, commentators in the United States had suggested that Britain was too polite, too cautious to ever take such a drastic step. Today, that assumption was proven disastrously wrong. What made the vote so shocking was not only the outcome, but the speed with which it had been executed. The motion had been introduced only 6 days earlier, debated behind closed doors for 72 hours, and brought to the floor with almost no public warning. Every traditional convention of parliamentary procedure had been disregarded. In modern history, exile motions, when they exist at all, take months of discussion, deliberation, and careful negotiation. This one, by contrast, had fallen like a guillotine, swift, sharp, and final. Inside Downing Street, aides to the Prime Minister scrambled to coordinate messaging with Buckingham Palace. The timing of the vote had been carefully planned. King Charles was attending a private engagement in Scotland, ensuring no one could accuse him of influencing Parliament directly. Prince William was safely in Windsor, his schedule meticulously cleared. Princess Anne was in Edinburgh. The senior members of the royal family had staged a deliberate absence from London, a silent choreography that communicated far more than any public statement could. But perhaps the most revealing reaction came from those who had campaigned hardest for this outcome. Senior Conservative MPs, many representing areas where public resentment toward the Sussexes had grown dangerously intense, expressed quiet relief rather than triumph. One backbencher, speaking anonymously to a reporter, said simply, "This wasn't about punishment, it was about survival. The monarchy cannot function while 2 of its former members wage war from abroad." That phrase, wage war, would dominate headlines for the rest of the day. Across the Atlantic, in Montecito, California, Harry and Meghan were waking to a nightmare they had long been warned about, but refused to believe could ever happen. Sources close to the couple say Meghan saw the alert first. She had been checking her phone during breakfast when the breaking news banner flashed across the screen. For several moments, she simply stared, stunned. Then, wordlessly, she handed the phone to Harry. It wasn't that the vote was surprising, it was that it was real, permanent, irrevocable. The legal consequences were immediate and severe. Under the terms of the motion, Harry and Meghan were banned from entering the United Kingdom for at least 10 years, with possible extensions to be reviewed by Parliament. Any attempt to return would trigger immediate arrest and deportation. Their properties in Britain, including Frogmore Cottage, would be seized by the Crown Estate. Their remaining ceremonial titles, already stripped of official duties, would be formally nullified. Even their children, Archie and Lilibet, would face restrictions on travel to the UK until they reached adulthood and could petition independently. By noon, Buckingham Palace issued a statement so short it felt almost cold in its brevity. The matter is one for Parliament and the government. The royal family will continue to focus on its duties. How did they arrive at this moment? Were there any hidden meetings? Let's find out. The secret briefings that trigger the royal exile. The first sign that something unprecedented was brewing came in early November, when a small group of MPs received invitations to a private briefing at the Cabinet Office. Official records called it a vague security consultation, enough to keep the press away. Attendees included senior Home Affairs Committee members, intelligence officials, and a few constitutional advisors whose job was understanding the delicate balance between monarchy and government. What they saw that evening changed everything. Intelligence reports compiled over the past 8 months revealed a disturbing pattern, even for those used to Sussex controversies. The briefing exposed coordinated media campaigns aimed at undermining certain royals, especially Catherine. It outlined financial links between PR firms associated with the Sussexes and outlets known for spreading false or misleading stories. Most alarming were communications showing that Harry and Meghan's team had discussed potential documentary projects with foreign media, moves that, in one analyst's words, could destabilize the monarchy from abroad. Technically, none of it was illegal, but in a country where the monarchy is a constitutional pillar, the implications were severe. One MP later described the mood in the room as like a funeral. "This wasn't tabloid drama anymore," he said privately. "We were looking at something that could fracture the relationship between Crown and Parliament if left unchecked." 3 weeks later, a second meeting took place at a secure Westminster location. By now, the circle had widened to include senior figures from both major parties, a rare display of bipartisan agreement in modern British politics. The Sussex situation had become something bigger than politics, a constitutional threat. Prince William was involved behind the scenes. He didn't attend meetings or lobby MPs directly, but his private secretary delivered briefings to key parliamentarians, emphasizing the palace's concerns and, crucially, making clear that the royal family would not block any legislative solution. That assurance was vital. Without it, Parliament could never have acted. Princess Anne also played her part. At a private dinner with senior ministers in late November, she made a remark that left those present unsettled. "Institutions survive by knowing when to amputate," she said. No further explanation was needed. Everyone understood she was referring to Harry and Meghan, and that the royal family, usually cautious about political involvement, was quietly endorsing the most extreme option. In early December, a subcommittee report on foreign influence operations dropped a hint that British nationals were engaged in media activities that could destabilize the structures of a key American ally. The report did not name Harry and Meghan, but it reached the Home Secretary immediately and shifted the entire calculation. A domestic royal drama had become an international security concern. The Exile motion was drafted in absolute secrecy. A small team of parliamentary lawyers and constitutional historians crafted language that could withstand legal challenges. They relied on an obscure 1703 precedent, never used against royals, but legally valid. By early December, the motion was ready. Speed was critical. Delays risked leaks, public pressure, and interference that could derail the vote. The final push came when King Charles authorized the release of private correspondence between himself and Harry, messages spanning 18 months showing repeated warnings about the consequences of continued attacks on the royal family. Carefully released to selected journalists, the letters shifted public opinion dramatically. Polls in Hatandi 48 hours before the vote showed strong support for decisive parliamentary action, especially among voters over 50. Even younger supporters of the Sussexes had grown wary, with 42% backing exile measures. By the morning of the vote, the result was certain. When the final margin exceeded expectations, it sent a clear signal. Britain's patience had ended. Harry and Meghan, from their California sanctuary, had misjudged the resolve of an entire royal family. But was Harry and Meghan aware of what was coming next? Let's take a closer look. What Harry and Meghan didn't anticipate. Throughout late autumn, those close to the Sussexes described a household living in a bubble of assumed security. Meghan, in particular, exuded a confidence that seemed unshakable. She believed that public opinion, especially in America, would act as a shield, protecting them from any serious consequences. Over the previous 3 years, she had carefully built a narrative casting them victims of an old racist institution. That story had struck a chord with certain groups, particularly younger Americans and progressive media outlets, who embraced it wholeheartedly. Yet she overlooked a critical truth. No matter how persuasive a story, reality has a way of catching up. Harry's position was more nuanced. Having grown up within the system, he knew its inner workings, its pressures, and its capacity for cold, calculated responses when threatened. But somewhere along the way, that understanding had curdled into contempt. Friends who had known him before his marriage described a man who had always bristled against royal restrictions, but had never truly believed the institution would turn against him. Being born royal, he thought, granted him a kind of permanent immunity, something Meghan, as an outsider, could never claim. The first warning signs appeared in October. Several of their key media allies in Britain began quietly withdrawing support. These were not hostile tabloids or critics. They were journalists who had once championed the couple, written sympathetic profiles, and defended them against attacks. One by one, they started refusing interview requests, stepping back from Sussex-related stories, and privately expressing concern that the narrative had grown too toxic to handle. One journalist, speaking months later on condition of anonymity, explained the shift. "We started hearing things from inside Parliament, not rumors, but real concrete information that something significant was being discussed. As reporters who value access, we had to make calculations. Supporting Harry and Meghan risked our relationships with government and palace sources. For many of us, that trade-off no longer made sense. The second warning came as legal notices. In early November, Harry's British legal team received a formal communication from the Home Office requesting clarification on points related to his residency, security arrangements, and ongoing litigation against UK media outlets. The letter's tone was bureaucratic, almost mundane, but the message was clear. The government was reviewing his standing, and this was no routine check. Harry reacted by instructing his lawyers to push back aggressively, treating the inquiry as yet another example of institutional harassment. Meghan, present during these discussions, encouraged this stance. She saw any hint of retreat as validation of the palace's tactics. What neither of them realized was that the Home Office inquiry wasn't harassment, it was preparation. The government was methodically laying the groundwork for decisions that would require detailed legal justification. Harry's combative response, ironically, made it easier to defend the eventual outcome. The third warning was impossible to ignore. In late November, William granted a rare interview with a senior political correspondent. While the interview ostensibly focused on his increased royal duties, one single line sent shockwaves among those who understood royal messaging. "There comes a point," William said carefully, "when protecting the institution requires difficult decisions that previous generations avoided." He never mentioned Harry, yet everyone understood the meaning. In California, however, the warning was dismissed. Meghan told friends that William was simply posturing, trying to appear decisive to a British public losing faith in the monarchy. Harry interpreted it as evidence of his brother's ambition and willingness to sacrifice family for power. Neither considered the alternative, that William was not threatening, but informed, that the decision had already been made, and that the machinery of consequence was already in motion. Harry and Meghan responded through their PR team. They would not be silenced, they would not apologize for speaking the truth, and they would not negotiate with a system designed to suppress them. According to insiders, the intermediary handling the message closed the communication channel and told associates they have no idea what's coming. On the morning of December 3rd, as MPs filed into Westminster to cast their votes, Harry and Meghan were in California, still treating the unfolding events as another chapter in an ongoing drama. But when the vote passed, the shock was complete, not because they were unaware of the motion, but because they had convinced themselves it would fail. They believed Britain, for all its bluster, would never actually exile a prince and his American wife. They assumed international embarrassment would prevent it, and that Charles, despite everything, would intervene on Harry's behalf. They were wrong on every count. As the reality settled over the following hours, shock gave way to a colder realization. It was not regret, at least not yet, but the recognition that they had burned bridges so thoroughly that no apology, passage of time, or maneuver could create a path back. For the first time since leaving Britain in 2020, Harry and Meghan faced a future with no contingency plan, no escape route, and no certainty about what would happen next. What legal means did the Parliament take? Let's find out. Constitutional shockwave that moved the monarchy. On December 3rd, what unfolded in Westminster was far more than political drama. It was a constitutional shockwave that legal experts will be dissecting for decades. Parliament voted to exile Harry and Meghan, triggering legal tools most people assumed belonged only to dusty history books. In the eyes of lawmakers, the couple had crossed a line no modern royal had ever approached. The legal basis for the exile comes from a quirky part of British constitutional law. Unlike countries with written constitutions that clearly set out powers, Britain relies on centuries of precedent and parliamentary supremacy. In simple terms, Parliament can pass almost any law at once if it can gather enough votes. The law used for the Sussexes' exile was originally created centuries ago to protect the nation during political crises. It gave Parliament the power to banish people whose actions were seen as a threat to the country's security or stability. The law was intentionally vague because back then, precision in legal language was considered a weakness. Modern scholars had assumed these powers were long outdated, replaced by human rights protections. December 3rd proved otherwise. The Home Office moved with astonishing speed. Within 6 hours of the vote, Harry and Meghan received formal notices through their lawyers. The documents, totaling 47 pages, spelled out the exile's terms in painstaking detail. They were barred from entering the UK for at least 10 years. Any attempt to return would lead to immediate arrest and removal. While their British passports weren't officially cancelled, international databases flagged them, alerting border officials worldwide. Property seizure followed just as quickly. Frogmore Cottage, the Windsor home they had lived in, was officially reclaimed by the Crown Estate before sunset. Their belongings were catalogued, packed and placed in secure storage for international shipping. Security protections were terminated instantly. Harry had long fought in British courts for taxpayer-funded police protection during visits, but that battle became irrelevant overnight. Intelligence sharing between British and American authorities on threats against the Sussexes was also suspended. While private American security could still operate, the loss of this link removed a critical layer of protection. Financial consequences were equally dramatic. Harry's remaining inheritance from Queen Elizabeth, held in trust and due in future installments, was frozen pending legal review. Constitutional experts scrambled for parallels. Edward VIII came closest, but his 1936 abdication was voluntary and never formalized through a parliamentary vote. What made Harry and Meghan's case historic was the mix of parliamentary action, royal agreement, and the revival of legal tools thought long dead. International law added further complication. The European Convention on Human Rights, which Britain still followed post-Brexit, could also provide grounds for legal challenge, since the right to return to one's country is considered fundamental. British lawyers had anticipated these challenges. The exile didn't ban Harry permanently. It was a time-limited restriction based on Parliament's judgment of constitutional necessity. That narrow distinction gave enough legal protection to withstand immediate challenges. By the evening of December 3rd, as legal filings began flooding London courts, one fact had become clear. The relationship between Britain and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had changed forever. For Harry, the deepest wound wasn't legal or financial. It was existential. He was born into a royal identity that could never be fully shed. Now, for the first time, that identity had been forcibly cut off from the only country that could validate it. How did the royal family react? Let's find out. The silent response from the royal family. After the parliamentary vote, Buckingham Palace was eerily still, almost as if every movement had been rehearsed in advance. There were no emergency meetings, no frantic phone calls, no signs of a crisis in motion. The staff went about their duties with the precision of people who had long anticipated this outcome, as though every step had been pre-programmed. In the private apartments of the senior royals, the reaction was not shock or despair, but something far stranger, almost unsettling: relief. King Charles spent the day in Scotland, following his usual schedule without interruption. He visited a Highland community project, exchanged brief words with local officials, and returned to Balmoral in the late afternoon. Observers noted no outward signs of anguish or hesitation. His face carried the familiar, composed fatigue that had settled there over months. If he mourned his son, it was in private spaces where no one dared intrude. His silence was deliberate, carefully planned, with advisors who knew that any visible emotion could be twisted. Show sorrow, and he would be branded weak. Show relief, and he would be accused of cruelty. So, he said nothing, letting the parliamentary vote speak for itself, quietly signaling that Harry's fate was no longer a matter requiring royal comment. Prince William's response was even colder. He spent the day at Windsor, adjusting his schedule to accommodate duties that would now fall more heavily on his shoulders. When a private secretary informed him of the vote tally, William simply nodded once, said nothing, and returned to his documents. For him, Harry's exile was not a family drama. It was a problem finally solved. The monarchy could not operate effectively while Harry and Meghan wielded influence from California. Now, at last, there was clarity. Catherine, meanwhile, experienced a tangle of feelings described by insiders as sadness tempered with pragmatism. She had once tried to forge a relationship with Meghan, efforts that were rebuffed and later turned into ammunition in interviews portraying Catherine as cold and distant. Princess Anne carried on in Edinburgh, executing her royal duties with her trademark efficiency. When asked about the parliamentary decision, she gave an answer that later leaked and shaped public discourse. Institutions endure by making hard choices. Today, Parliament made one. Her words were sparse, but they left no doubt. Anne saw the exile as necessary, not punitive. Queen Camilla took a different approach. She stayed at Clarence House, said nothing publicly, and skipped all scheduled events. But those close to her understood that her silence carried weight. She knew better than anyone the dangerous precedent this vote set. The palace's official statement, released at 14:30, was astonishing in its brevity. The matter decided by Parliament today is a constitutional question outside the scope of royal commentary. The family's focus remains on service to the nation. 29 words. No mention of Harry. No expression of regret. No hint of emotion. Just a clinical acknowledgement that the issue had moved from royal hands to state authority. Behind this public stillness, however, private preparations were already in motion. Advisors to Charles reviewed succession protocols to prevent legal uncertainties from Harry's exile. William's team coordinated messaging with government officials, anticipating extended media scrutiny. Across the royal household, staff braced for backlash from Sussex supporters, readying for arguments that the monarchy had acted with cruelty. International reactions added pressure. In the United States, sympathetic media portrayed the family as enforcers of an archaic punishment. CNN questioned whether the British monarchy had a place in a modern democracy. The New York Times published an op-ed painting the exile as proof of institutional toxicity. For the palace, this uproar was expected. The strategy was simple: let the noise rage, offer no response, and let time blunt the outrage. Still, subtle cracks appeared. Late in the evening at Balmoral, Charles was seen standing alone by a window, staring across the grounds, his expression impossible to read. William Tristram, too, showed fleeting moments of vulnerability. During a private conversation with Catherine, accidentally overheard by a passing staff member, he reportedly said, "I didn't want it to come to this, but he left us no choice." Even this rare admission emphasized necessity, not regret. What does this exile mean for Harry and Meghan's future? Let's take a closer look. Harry and Meghan's future. As the winter sun dipped behind Montecito on the 3rd of December, Harry and Meghan faced a future more uncertain than anything they had experienced since stepping back from royal life in 2020. The parliamentary vote to exile them hadn't just closed a door, it had sealed an entire corridor of possibilities they had long assumed would remain open. No matter how tense the family dynamics had become, they had believed on some level that a return to Britain was always possible. That belief died at 11:43 that morning in Westminster. The practical consequences hit immediately. Travel became far more complicated than they had ever imagined. Though both held valid passports, Harry's flagged status meant extra scrutiny at every border. Countries with close intelligence ties to Britain or extradition agreements might now treat him as a security concern. Invitations to European events, once routine, would require careful vetting, leaving hosts worried about diplomatic fallout. Financial pressures, already significant, deepened. The couple's income had relied heavily on their royal connection, telling insider stories, positioning themselves as voices revealing institutional failings. Exile changed that equation. They were no longer brave whistleblowers. They were exiled former royals, a category that tends to evoke sympathy rather than profit. Media partners like Netflix and Spotify would now have to reconsider whether the Sussex brand still held the commercial value it once did. For their children, Archie and Lilibet, the stakes stretched across decades. Both had dual American-British citizenship, but the exile, while not legally binding on them, cast a long shadow. Would they be welcomed in Britain as adults? Or would their parents' exile follow them forever, closing doors to cousins and grandparents they might otherwise have known? The psychological effects would emerge gradually, but trauma specialists would spot the signs immediately. Harry, after 40 years defined by his royal identity, even in rebellion, suddenly had to confront a world without Britain, without the palace, without the very institution that had shaped him. Meghan's position was different, but no less complex. She had entered the royal family as an outsider, endured what she described as racist and cruel treatment, and built a public life exposing it. For some, the exile might appear as vindication, a confirmation of the toxicity she had long claimed. But exile also meant failure, an inability to navigate a system that countless women before her had survived. In Hollywood, where outcomes outweigh morality, failure is rarely forgiven. The consequences extended internationally. The United States government, officially neutral, quietly felt pressure from British diplomats to monitor Sussex activities. While outright restrictions were unlikely, the message was clear. Content attacking the British monarchy could trigger diplomatic fallout. Even soft power has limits, even for Americans married to exiled princes. For the monarchy, the exile solved a pressing problem. Harry and Meghan could no longer destabilize the institution from within, but it created new vulnerabilities. International criticism was intense. Younger generations, especially outside Britain, saw the move as proof that the monarchy was outdated, vindictive, and incapable of change. Those perceptions would not fade quickly. Prince William, now heir without a rival brother, faced a different kind of scrutiny. He would be measured not just on his own leadership, but on whether the monarchy he would one day lead could justify the coldness shown to Harry. So, what do you think about the shocking move by the UK Parliament to exile Harry and Meghan from Britain? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe.